morning fog off the Pacific Ocean did not just roll into the Olympic Peninsula. It crawled. It moved through the towering stands of Douglas fir and ancient red cedars, like a living, breathing entity, swallowing the rugged Washington coastline in a thick slate-gray dampness. This was the edge of the world, the boundary line where modern America ended and something far older, far less tame began. Here, the earth smelled of decaying pine needles, crushed fern, and the heavy metallic tang of rain that never truly stopped. It was a landscape that demanded respect. It was a place that did not care about the affairs of men. Gareth was 68 years old. He had spent his entire life in the shadow of these mountains. He was a man built of cordwood and quiet dignity, a former beta whose joints now ached when the barometer dropped, but whose hands were still steady enough to swing a splitting maul. He had spent nearly 7 decades oriented by an instinct that ran deeper than conscious thought. It was the constant, low-frequency hum of awareness that every shifter carried in their blood. The sense of the pack, the pull of the moon, the instinctual mapping of every predator and prey moving through the dark at the forest's edge. It was a companion he had known since birth, a second soul sharing his heartbeat. Elara was 22, standing on the porch of their cabin, wiping axe grease from her hands with a heavy canvas rag. She watched Gareth by the eastern fence line. He was mending a broken post, his breath pluming in the frigid morning air. Elara had no wolf in her blood. She was human and orphan, taken in by Gareth when she was nothing more than a shivering child found wandering near the tree line. But what she lacked in supernatural instinct, she made up for in quiet, rigorous observation. She knew the topography of the Olympic range better than any government surveyor. She understood the weather patterns, the medicinal properties of the undergrowth, and the delicate, dangerous moods of the apex predators that stalked the high ridges. She heard it before she saw it. It was a sound that did not belong in the throat of a healthy man. It was low, hollow, and fundamentally wrong. It was the sound of a foundation cracking. Elara dropped the canvas rag. She crossed the frost-hardened yard in a dead sprint. Gareth did not stumble. He did not trip. He collapsed. It was as if the invisible strings holding him upright had been violently severed with a blade. He hit the dirt hard, his calloused hands pressing flat against the freezing Washington soil, his knuckles white, his broad shoulders heaving. He was gripping the earth as if the entire world had suddenly tilted on its axis and was trying to throw him off into the void. Elara dropped to her knees beside him. The icy mud soaked instantly through her heavy denim jeans. Gareth. Her voice was sharp, a triage nurse cutting through the panic of a trauma ward. Her hands found his shoulders. They were trembling violently. Gareth, look at me. He raised his head. When his eyes met hers, the breath caught in Elara's throat. Gareth's eyes had always been a sharp, piercing amber. They had always held the quiet, dangerous intelligence of the wolf just beneath the surface. Now they were empty. They were not clouded by cataracts or glazed with the fever of an infection. They were blank. It was the specific, terrifying blankness of a man who has suddenly been deafened in a silent room. A man who has reached into the deepest part of his own chest and found nothing but a hollow cavity. "It's gone," Gareth whispered. His voice was terrifyingly steady. That made the horror of it so much worse. There was no hysteria, only the profound, crushing weight of an amputation. All of it, he rasped, his fingers digging into the dirt, trying to find an anchor that no longer existed. The hum, the boundary markers. I can't feel the pack. I can't feel the forest. Elara, I can't feel anything. Elara kept her hands firmly on his shoulders. She did not let her face betray a single ounce of fear. She was the anchor now. "Breathe," she commanded, her voice a steady drumbeat in the creeping panic. "Just focus on the air. In and out. You are here. You are grounded." She pressed 2 fingers against the carotid artery at his neck. His pulse was rapid pounding with adrenaline, but his skin was cool. No fever, no sign of stroke, no localized pain. This was not a failure of the flesh. This was a failure of the spirit. By nightfall, the creeping dread had a name. The silence. It moved through the small, secluded shifter communities of the Olympic Peninsula like a phantom tide. By the following dawn, 12 more had fallen. By the end of the week, the number had quadrupled. The symptoms were identical in every single case. A sudden catastrophic erosion of the shifter senses. The severing of the ancient bond between the human mind and the animal soul. The younger ones fought it. They described a terrifying disorientation, a blinding vertigo, as their heightened hearing and smell were suddenly dialed back to dull, inadequate human levels. They thrashed in their beds, gripped by phantom pains, reaching for a wolf that was no longer there. The older ones, the veterans like Gareth, simply went quiet. They sat in their armchairs, staring at the walls, mourning the death of a lifelong companion. Elara worked tirelessly. She converted the local community hall into a makeshift triage center. She applied every piece of medical knowledge she possessed. She ran intravenous fluids. She administered heavy sedatives to the panicked youth. She brewed potent tinctures from the willow bark and yarrow she had mapped and harvested from the lower ridges. None of it worked. The fever reducers did nothing because there was no fever. The sedatives offered brief oblivion, but no cure. The silence was not a pathogen that could be isolated under a microscope. It was not a heavy metal poisoning the local aquifer. It was a metaphysical rot. It was moving along pathways that modern medicine could not chart, attacking the very thread that bound the shifter to the earth. Elara stood on the back porch of the community hall, a steaming mug of black coffee in her hands, looking eastward. Beyond the logging roads, beyond the mist-shrouded foothills, lay the deep timber, the sacred woods, a massive uncharted expanse of the Olympic National Forest, where the pines grew so thick and close together that midday light arrived on the forest floor only as shattered fragments. It was a place that defied mapping. GPS signals died at the tree line. Compasses spun in lazy, useless circles. The topography shifted in subtle, impossible ways, punishing those who tried to impose human order upon it. Somewhere past the second ridge, hidden deep within the emerald dark, lay the source, the underground spring, the ancient wellspring of the Earth's magic. Elara knew the cure was there. She knew it with the same absolute certainty that she knew the sun would rise over the Cascades. But she also knew the guardian of the woods. Elara closed her eyes, letting the bitter steam of the coffee warm her face. A memory surfaced clear and sharp as cracked ice. She was 5 years old. It was twilight. She had wandered away from Gareth's cabin, drawn by the strange hypnotic silence of the tree line. She had been holding a piece of heavy, crusty bread. She stood at the edge of the deep timber, looking into the shadows. And then the shadows moved. He stepped out of the pines without making a single sound. He was colossal. A wolf the size of a draft horse. His coat was the pristine, blinding white of a fresh Washington blizzard. His eyes were the pale, luminous silver of a winter sky right before the storm breaks. He was an apex predator from an age before men built fires. He was the ghost wolf. Any normal child would have screamed. Any adult would have fallen to their knees in primal terror. 5-year-old Elara had simply looked at him. She felt no fear, only a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. A stillness that settled into her bones. She took a step forward, then another. She held out her small, trembling hand, offering the piece of bread. The giant wolf looked at the bread. Then he looked at her. He leaned his massive head forward. His breath was cold, smelling of ozone and crushed pine. He took the bread from her fingers with a delicacy that defied his monstrous size. He chewed it slowly. Then he pressed his wet nose against her forehead, leaving a smudge of dirt and a sensation of absolute safety before turning and vanishing back into the dark. For 17 years, that silent pact had held. The ghost wolf allowed no alpha, no hunter, no logger to pass the boundary. Men who tried with guns and arrogance were found days later wandering the logging roads, their minds broken, their weapons bent into useless scrap. But Elara walked the fringes of the sacred woods freely. She harvested her herbs. She mapped the safe paths. She did not conquer the forest. She existed in harmony with it. She opened her eyes, staring at the distant, jagged peaks. The ghost wolf would not let a tainted sickness claim the land. The cure was there. But she also knew she could not simply walk in and take it. The forest demanded a toll. It demanded a demonstration of worth. The crunch of heavy tires on gravel broke her concentration. Elara turned. A convoy of 4 massive matte black SUVs was rolling slowly down the main street of the logging town. They were heavy armored vehicles entirely out of place among the rusted pickup trucks and logging equipment. They moved with a deliberate, synchronized precision. The vehicles came to a halt in front of the community hall. The heavy doors opened. Men in dark tactical gear stepped out. They were massive, broad-shouldered, moving with the lethal grace of predators. But there was a tightness in their jaws, a restless, erratic energy to their movements. They were panicked. They were fighting the same creeping silence that was destroying the town. From the second vehicle, a man stepped down into the Washington mud. He did not wear tactical gear. He wore a simple, heavy wool coat over a dark shirt. He was tall, powerfully built, with dark hair swept back from a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite. But it was his presence that commanded the space. It hit the air like a physical shockwave, an aura of absolute crushing authority. This was King Thane. He was 30 years old, the alpha prime of the entire Pacific Northwest. From the coastal ports of Seattle to the rugged peaks of the Rockies, his word was law. He was a man who bore the weight of a hidden nation on his shoulders. He was not a tyrant. He was a protector. A tactician who ruled not just through brute strength, but through calculated, honorable leadership. But as Elara watched him walk toward the steps of the hall, her trained medical eyes caught the subtle imperfections in his gait. His stride was fractionally uneven. His breathing was carefully controlled, too controlled, as if he were hiding a deep, persistent ache. The golden hue of his eyes, the unmistakable mark of an Alpha Prime, flickered slightly dulling at the edges. The king was dying. The silence was already eating at his soul. Behind Thane walked an older man clutching a leather-bound satchel. He had the stooped posture of a man who had spent decades hunched over ancient texts. His eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses were sharp and constantly moving, taking in the environment with academic hunger. This was Dr. Aldous, the royal scholar. Elara did not retreat. She stood at the top of the wooden steps, her hands thrust deep into the pockets of her jacket. She did not bow. She did not avert her gaze. In the hierarchy of the shifter world, an orphaned human Omega was less than nothing. But here on the edge of the sacred woods, the hierarchy of men meant absolutely nothing to her. Thane stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked up at her, his golden eyes locked onto her green ones. For a moment, the air between them was thick with tension. The king's guards bristled their hands, dropping to their sides, offended by the young woman's lack of deference. Thane raised a single hand. The guards froze. "You are Elara," Thane said. His voice was a deep baritone, rough as coarse grit sandpaper. It was a voice used to giving commands that were instantly obeyed. But right now there was a raw, frayed edge to it. "I am," Elara replied, her voice steady. "I have lost 40 of my best wolves in the last 5 days." Thane said, his jaw tightening. "My border patrols are blind. My lieutenants are bedridden. The rot is spreading through the aquifers moving down from the mountains." He took a slow breath, hiding a grimace. "My scholar tells me the origin of this plague and its cure lies within the Olympic exclusion zone, the sacred woods." "Dr. Aldous is correct," Elara said, glancing at the old scholar who offered a small, respectful nod. "It's not a pathogen. It's an environmental toxin. Heavy metals mixed with something older, something meant to sever the connection between mind and beast. The cure is the luminescence root. It grows only at the source deep past the second ridge." Thane stepped forward, putting his boot on the first wooden stair. "I am taking a tactical team into the woods. We will locate the source. We will extract the root. I was told you are the only one who has successfully mapped the perimeter. I need your charts." It wasn't a request. It was an expectation. Elara looked at the heavily armed men behind him. She looked at their tactical vests, their silver-laced combat knives, the rigid, aggressive posture of their bodies. She felt a surge of cold, hard anger. "No," Elara said. The word dropped into the morning air like a stone on glass. One of the guards, a massive brute with a scarred jaw, snarled and took a step forward. "Watch your tone, girl. You are speaking to the Alpha Prime." Elara didn't even look at the guard. She kept her eyes locked on Thane. "Your charts are useless," Elara said, her voice echoing in the quiet courtyard. "GPS does not work past the tree line. Compasses are dead weight. The topography changes depending on the intent of the person walking it. If you march into that forest with 12 armed men acting like conquerors, you will not find the source. You will find a maze that will slowly starve you to death. Or worse, the Guardian will find you. And he does not leave survivors." Thane's eyes narrowed. The golden light in them flared a sudden instinctual push of alpha dominance. It was a pressure in the air, a psychic weight designed to force submission. Elara felt it wash over her. It felt like standing in a heavy wind. But she had spent her life standing in the presence of the ghost wolf. The dominance of a mortal king, even an Alpha Prime, was nothing compared to the ancient weight of the forest. She did not flinch. She did not lower her chin. Thane saw it. The flare in his eyes subsided, replaced by a flicker of genuine surprise. He studied her face, taking in the dark circles under her eyes, the stained denim, the absolute unshakable resolve in her posture. He recognized a fellow protector when he saw one. "Dr. Aldous warned me," Thane said softly, almost to himself. "He said the woods require a guide, not a general. He said the Guardian has chosen a speaker." Thane looked back up at her. The edge of command was gone from his voice. "I am losing my mind, Elara. My people are suffering. I cannot protect them. If I don't find this cure, the Northwest falls into chaos." "What are your terms?" he was asking. The Alpha King was asking an orphaned Omega for terms. Elara let out a slow breath. The tension in her shoulders dropped a fraction. "You leave the army behind," Elara said, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. No guns, no silver, no tactical gear. Just you. You pack survival gear rations for 2 weeks and you follow my exact footsteps. When I tell you to stop, you freeze. When I tell you to walk, you walk. You do not issue commands. You do not try to dominate the terrain. You are a guest in a house that is far older than your bloodline. If you can accept that, I will take you to the source. Thane looked at his men. They were staring at him in disbelief. The idea of the king walking unarmed into the most dangerous exclusion zone in the country, guided by a human woman, was military suicide. My king, you cannot be serious, the scarred guard protested. It's a trap. Let us burn a path to the center. We have the firepower. Firepower is what got 3 royal expeditions slaughtered in the last century, Dr. Aldous interjected, his voice trembling but firm. The girl speaks the truth, my king. The old texts are explicitly clear. The forest responds to arrogance with annihilation. Thane looked back at Elara. He saw the steady, uncompromising truth in her eyes. He felt the sickening hollow ache in his own chest where his wolf was slowly bleeding out. He had built his reign on strength, on the ability to overpower any obstacle. Now he was being asked to surrender that strength entirely. It was the hardest decision of his life. Thane unbuckled his tactical holster. He handed his heavy sidearm to the scarred guard. He reached into his boot, withdrew a silver hunting knife, and tossed it onto the dirt. Stand down, Thane commanded his men. Set up a perimeter around the town. Assist the sick. Do not follow me. He walked up the wooden steps until he was standing on the porch beside Elara. Up close, she could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the pale sheen of sweat on his forehead. He was holding himself together by sheer willpower. I am in your hands, Elara, Thane said quietly. Lead the way. They departed within the hour. The hike to the boundary line was taken in silence. The heavy morning fog had begun to burn off, revealing the staggering scale of the Olympic timber. The trees here were monsters of bark and moss, their trunks so wide a car could drive through them, their canopies interlocking hundreds of feet above to block out the pale Washington sun. The air grew colder, heavier. Elara walked, pointer canvas backpack strapped tight, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Thane walked 3 paces behind her. He moved with the silent, fluid grace of a hunter, his heavy boots making almost no sound on the damp pine needles. They reached the edge of the sacred woods. There was no fence, no warning sign, but the demarcation was as clear as a line drawn in blood. On their side, the forest was normal. Birds chirped in the high branches. Squirrels darted across the moss. Wind rustled the ferns. On the other side of an invisible line between 2 massive twisted cedars, there was nothing but profound, suffocating silence. The shadows there were deeper, pooling like black water. The air did not move. It felt like looking into the open mouth of a leviathan. Elara stopped. She took a deep breath, centering herself. She closed her eyes, offering a silent, respectful greeting to the earth beneath her boots. Then she stepped across the threshold. Nothing changed for her. The air was cold. The ground was damp. She was home. She turned to look at Thane. He was standing on the edge, looking into the gloom. He took a breath, his jaw set in a hard line, and stepped across the boundary. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. Thane stopped dead in his tracks. A sharp, ragged gasp tore from his throat. He staggered forward, his hands flying up to grip the sides of his head. He dropped to one knee, the heavy thud of his body echoing in the unnatural silence. Elara rushed back to him, keeping her distance, watching him carefully. Thane was shaking. His eyes were wide open, staring blindly at the forest floor. The golden hue that marked him as the Alpha Prime had completely vanished, leaving his eyes a stark human hazel. He was gasping for air, his chest heaving as if he had just been plunged into freezing water. Thane, Elara said sharply, stay with me. What is it? I can't. Thane choked out, his voice stripped of all its resonance, sounding thin and fragile. I can't hear. He wasn't physically deaf, but Elara understood instantly. For 30 years, Thane's hearing had extended for miles. He could hear the heartbeat of a deer across a valley. He could hear the shifting of soil, the subtle changes in wind pressure. His sense of smell could deconstruct 1,000 different scents, mapping the world in a rich, 3-dimensional tapestry of information. His alpha presence was a radar constantly pinging off the minds and bodies of the predators around him. The moment he crossed the boundary, the sacred woods took it all away. The forest reached into his mind and threw a heavy leaden blanket over his senses. It severed his connection to the ambient magic of the world. It violently compressed his awareness down to the pathetic, limited scope of a mortal man. The silence he was experiencing was not the absence of sound. It was the terrifying, claustrophobic absence of the world he had known his entire life. He was blind. He was deaf. He was mortal. Thane dug his fingers into the damp earth, fighting down a wave of pure primal panic. The instinct to shift, to bring forth the beast and roar against the darkness was overwhelming. He pushed with his mind, trying to force his alpha will out into the forest, trying to demand that the environment yield to his authority. The forest pushed back. A wave of crushing pressure descended on him. It felt as though the atmospheric weight had quadrupled. The ancient pines seemed to lean inward, their massive shadows stretching toward him like grasping fingers. The air grew so thick he could barely pull it into his lungs. The harder he fought, the tighter the forest squeezed. "Stop fighting it!" Elara shouted, stepping closer, her voice cutting through his panic. "Thane, listen to me. You cannot conquer this place. It is older than you. It is stronger than you. If you push your alpha dominance, the forest will crush you into the dirt. You have to let it go." Thane looked up at her. His face was pale, slick with sweat. He was a king who had never surrendered in his life. The concept of yielding was anathema to his very core. "Drop the crown!" Elara urged, her green eyes blazing with intensity. "You are not a king here. You are just a man. Accept the blindness. Accept the silence. Yield." Thane closed his eyes. His jaw muscles jumped as he fought a silent, agonizing war against his own nature. He took a ragged breath, and then slowly, agonizingly, he let the tension bleed out of his shoulders. He stopped pushing. He stopped demanding that the world make sense to him. He pulled his fractured will back into himself, shrinking his presence down until he was nothing more than a single heartbeat in the vast, overwhelming dark. The crushing pressure immediately lifted. The air thinned, becoming breathable again. The shadows receded to their normal static positions. Thane opened his eyes. He was breathing heavily, his hands resting on his knees. He looked around. The forest was just a forest, dark, cold, and silent. He was still stripped of his powers. He could only see as far as the human eye allowed. He could only hear the rustle of Elara's jacket. He looked up at the young woman standing over him. She was entirely unaffected. She stood in the gloom with the relaxed, comfortable posture of someone standing in their own living room. For the first time in his life, Alpha Prime Thane felt completely and utterly vulnerable. He was entirely at the mercy of the woman standing before him. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been obliterated. "You're okay," Elara said softly, her voice losing its sharp edge. She offered him a hand. Thane stared at her hand for a long moment. It was small, calloused from hard work, smeared with dirt. It was the hand of a commoner, an Omega. He reached up, grasped her hand, and let her pull him to his feet. His grip was firm, but there was a new carefulness in it, a profound, hard-won respect. "Thank you," Thane said, his voice quiet, devoid of command. "Keep your head down, keep your mouth shut, and step exactly where I step," Elara instructed, turning back toward the trail. "The woods know you are here. They are watching." They moved deeper. For an hour they navigated a treacherous path of slick roots, moss-covered boulders, and dense hazel thickets. Thane struggled. Without his enhanced balance, he stumbled over hidden roots. Without his night vision, the shadows played tricks on his eyes. He felt clumsy, slow, and horribly exposed. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. Elara moved with an effortless, gliding grace. She read the environment not through supernatural instinct, but through years of meticulous observation. She knew which moss was slippery and which offered grip. She knew the subtle changes in the wind that indicated a drop in elevation. She was navigating the impossible maze, and Thane realized with a jolt of humility that without her he would be dead in a day. They reached a small clearing where the canopy broke slightly, allowing a shaft of pale gray light to illuminate a patch of frost-covered ferns. Elara stopped abruptly. She held up a closed fist. Thane froze instantly, his military training taking over. He strained his inadequate human ears listening. He heard nothing. He smelled nothing but wet pine. But Elara felt it, the sudden drastic drop in barometric pressure, the absolute cessation of all ambient noise. The woods didn't just go quiet, they held their breath. From the dense wall of pines on the far side of the clearing, the shadows detached themselves. Thane felt a primal jolt of adrenaline hit his system like a physical blow. His hand dropped instinctively to the knife that was no longer in his boot. The ghost wolf stepped into the light. It was larger than any myth Thane had ever heard. It stood taller than a cavalry horse at the shoulder. Its musculature was massive, rolling beneath a coat of blinding white fur that seemed to absorb the meager light in the clearing. Its paws were the size of dinner plates, completely silent on the dry leaves. But it was the eyes that froze the blood in Thane's veins. They were silver, ancient, fathomless silver. They held an intelligence that was cold, calculating, and utterly alien. This was not a shifter. This was not an animal. This was the raw incarnate spirit of the Olympic range. The colossal beast stopped 10 yards away. It lowered its massive head, its silver eyes locking onto Thane. A low, vibrating growl began in its chest. It was a sound so deep it didn't register in the ears, but in the marrow of the bones. It was a physical vibration that rattled Thane's teeth. Thane's alpha instincts buried under the forest's suppression flared in a final desperate act of self-preservation. The beast inside him screamed to fight, to assert dominance, to protect its territory. Thane stepped forward, placing himself between Elara and the colossal predator. He squared his shoulders, his golden eyes briefly flashing through the suppression, and he let out a low, challenging snarl from the back of his throat. It was the bravest, most foolish thing he could have done. The ghost wolf did not roar. It did not leap. It simply exhaled. A wave of kinetic force, cold as a glacier, slammed into Thane's chest. He was lifted off his feet and thrown backward through the air. He crashed hard into the trunk of a massive cedar, the breath exploding from his lungs in a violent rush. He crumpled to the forest floor, gasping, his vision swimming with black spots. His entire body felt as if it had been hit by a freight train. He struggled to push himself up on trembling arms, tasting blood in his mouth. He looked up, expecting the massive jaws to close around his throat. Instead, he saw Elara. She had not run. She had not screamed. She walked forward past the gasping, broken king of the Northwest. She approached the monster that had just swatted an Alpha Prime aside like a nuisance. She walked with a calm, deliberate rhythm. No sudden movements. No fear. Her posture was relaxed, her hands open and visible at her sides. "Easy," Elara said. Her voice was soft, carrying a strange rhythmic cadence, a tonal frequency she had practiced for years. The bad dog command. Not a threat, but a boundary, a demand for calm. We are not here for blood. We are here for healing. The ghost wolf stopped growling. It stood perfectly still as the tiny human woman walked right up to its massive, terrifying face. Thane watched from the dirt, his heart hammering against his ribs, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Elara reached up. She placed her bare hand flat against the ghost wolf's scarred white snout. The beast closed its silver eyes. It leaned its massive weight into her touch, letting out a long, heavy sigh that rustled the ferns around them. Then the beast lowered its shoulder. It was a deliberate, unmistakable gesture of submission, or rather, an invitation. Elara gripped the thick, coarse fur behind the wolf's ears. With a fluid, practiced motion, she pulled herself up, swinging her leg over the beast's broad back. She settled in just behind its massive shoulders, her hands resting comfortably in its fur. The ghost wolf stood to its full, terrifying height. Elara sat atop the ancient god of the forest, looking down from a height of 7 feet. In the history of the shifter world, no alpha, no matter how powerful, how brutal, or how wise, had ever tamed a spirit of the earth. They conquered men. They conquered wolves, but the earth belonged to itself. Yet here in the darkest heart of the Washington timber, an orphaned human omega sat astride the absolute power of nature. Thane knelt in the damp moss, coughing quietly, clutching his bruised ribs. He looked up at the girl. The pale light caught her white hair, making it shine like spun silver against the dark pines. She looked magnificent. She looked terrifying. She possessed an authority that made his crown feel like a cheap trinket. Elara looked down at the king. Her green eyes were calm, but they held a new, undeniable weight. "Can you walk?" she asked, her voice echoing softly in the clearing. Thane spat a mouthful of blood onto the pine needles. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, fighting the searing pain in his chest. He pushed himself upright, his legs shaking slightly before he locked his knees. He looked at the massive wolf and then up at the woman riding it. His pride was shattered. His power was gone, but his mind was crystal clear. "I can walk," Thane rasped, his voice rough but steady. "Good," Elara said, turning the massive wolf toward the deep trail. "Stay close. The real forest begins now." The ghost wolf moved forward, parting the dense undergrowth like a ship cutting through water. King Thane, stripped of his power, humbled by the earth, fell into step behind them. The long, brutal journey to the source had begun, and the balance of power in the Pacific Northwest had just been irrevocably, permanently altered. The ghost wolf vanished on the morning of the second day. It did not run. It simply stepped behind a massive curtain of hanging moss and ceased to exist, leaving Elara and King Thane completely alone in the deepest, most unforgiving sector of the Olympic range. Without the ancient predator to carve a path, the forest closed in around them like a tightening fist. The canopy overhead grew so dense that the concept of day and night blurred into a perpetual, suffocating twilight. The air was heavy with the smell of decaying wood and damp earth. It was a landscape designed to break the human spirit. Thane was breaking. By the time the sun set on their third day, the Alpha Prime was a shadow of the man who had stepped out of the armored vehicle in the logging town. Stripped of his wolf, his body was entirely human, and that human body was failing at a terrifying speed. He stumbled, his heavy boots dragged through the thick mud. His breathing was shallow, rapid, and punctuated by harsh, dry coughs that rattled deep in his chest. The golden light in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by the dull, glassy stare of a man fighting a losing battle against his own biology. Elara watched him carefully adjusting the straps of her heavy canvas pack. She knew the signs of exhaustion. She knew the signs of exposure. But this was different. This was systemic collapse. They made camp under the overhang of a hollowed-out cedar tree. Elara gathered dry kindling from the inner bark, her hands moving with practiced mechanical efficiency. She struck a magnesium rod, catching a spark on some dry moss, and blew it gently into a small, steady flame. Thane collapsed against the far wall of the hollow. He did not sit. He simply gave up the fight against gravity. His head slumped forward. His skin was the color of old ash. Elara moved to his side. She pulled off her heavy leather gloves and pressed the back of her hand against his forehead. He was burning. The heat radiating off his skin was unnatural, a dry, localized fever that spoke of deep internal infection. But his hands and face were ice cold. His body was shutting down blood flow to his extremities to protect his failing organs. The toxin, Thane whispered, his voice barely a rasp over the crackle of the fire. It is in the marrow, without the wolf to burn it out. It is eating the human. He was right. The silence was not just a mental block. It was a physical poison. Whatever the sickness was, it had been designed to kill the shifter by isolating the human and then destroying it from the inside out. The temperature in the Olympic timber plummeted as the night deepened. The cold here was not just a drop in degrees, it was a physical weight. It seeped up through the roots. It rolled off the glacial peaks in the north. Thane began to violently shiver. His teeth chattered with a sound like cracking stones. His body was entering the final stages of hypothermia, his internal thermostat completely shattered by the poison. Elara opened her medical kit. She had no broad-spectrum antibiotics that could fight this. She had no adrenaline. She only had the raw, brutal mechanics of wilderness survival. She unrolled the heavy thermal sleeping bag, spreading it out as close to the fire as safety allowed. Thane, Elara said. Her voice was flat, authoritative. It held no pity. Pity killed people in the woods. Take off your coat. Take off the wet layers, now. Thane looked up at her through half-closed eyes. His brain was sluggish, processing her words through a haze of agony. His fingers fumbled uselessly at the heavy metal clasps of his wool coat. He lacked the motor control to even undress himself. Elara did not hesitate. She knelt beside him. Her hands were swift and entirely professional. She stripped the heavy coat from his shoulders. She pulled his damp sweater over his head. She unbuttoned his undershirt, baring his broad, heavily scarred chest to the freezing air. He shivered violently, a deep, involuntary spasm that arched his spine. Get in the bag, she ordered. Thane dragged himself into the thermal cocoon curling onto his side. But the bag alone would not save him. His core temperature was too low. He could not generate his own heat. He was a dying engine that could not spark. Elara stood up. She unzipped her own heavy canvas jacket. She pulled off her thick flannel shirt, leaving herself in nothing but a thin cotton undershirt and her denim jeans. The freezing air hit her skin like a swarm of needles. She ignored it. This was not a moment for modesty. This was triage. She slid into the sleeping bag behind the Alpha Prime. She pulled the heavy thermal material up over their heads, sealing them into a pocket of darkness. She pressed the entire length of her body against his bare back, skin to skin. She wrapped her arms tightly around his broad chest, locking her hands together, anchoring him. She tangled her legs with his, maximizing the surface area of contact. Thane let out a choked, ragged breath as the sudden, shocking heat of her body hit his freezing skin. Stay still, Elara whispered near his ear. Her voice was steady, calm, the rhythmic hum of a machine doing exactly what it was built to do. Draw the heat. Just breathe. For a man who had spent his life isolated by absolute power, the sudden, overwhelming intimacy of another human being pressing themselves against his weakest, most vulnerable moment was a profound shock. He was the king. He was supposed to be the shield. Now he was shivering in the dark, kept alive solely by the body heat of a woman he barely knew. He did not fight it. He surrendered to the mechanics of survival. Hour after hour, they lay there in the dark. Elara focused on her own breathing, keeping her heart rate steady, acting as a human furnace. She felt every shudder that racked his frame. She felt the erratic, terrifying leaps of his heartbeat beneath her hands. Slowly, agonizingly, the violent shivering began to subside. The unnatural heat of the toxin fever began to break against the steady, relentless warmth she provided. By dawn, Thane was asleep. It was a true exhausted sleep, not a comatose fade. Elara slipped out of the bag in the gray morning light, her muscles aching from holding the rigid posture all night. She dressed quietly, built up the fire, and began to boil water. When Thane finally woke, the immediate danger had passed. He was weak, hollowed out, but the ash color had left his skin. He sat up, pulling the sleeping bag around his shoulders. He looked at Elara, who was meticulously charting a topographic map with a stub of charcoal. He remembered the night. He remembered the complete stripping away of his dignity. "You saved my life," Thane said softly. Elara did not look up from her map. "I stabilized your core temperature. You are still dying. The map indicates a ridgeline 3 miles east. We move in 20 minutes. She offered no sentiment. She demanded no gratitude. She was a professional executing a job. And in that moment, looking at her uncompromising profile against the morning fire, King Thane felt a profound foundational shift in his chest, a deep, abiding respect that had nothing to do with crowns or wolves. It took them 2 days to cover those 3 miles. The terrain grew vicious, but on the afternoon of the 5th day, the natural geometry of the forest broke. Elara stopped at the edge of a deep ravine. The smell hit her first. It was not the organic rot of the woods. It was sharp, acrid, and metallic. It smelled of sulfur and synthetic lubricants. Thane came up beside her, leaning heavily on a walking stick he had carved. He looked down into the ravine. His jaw tightened into a hard white line. Hidden beneath a massive canopy of camouflage netting, built directly over a tributary of the river that fed the entire lower valley, was a brutal industrial scar. It was a drilling site. Massive steel derricks were driving heavy pipes deep into the earth. Rusted barrels of chemical runoff were stacked haphazardly near the water's edge. Thick black sludge was leaking from the barrels, sliding down the muddy bank and bleeding directly into the rushing water of the aquifer. This was not a logging camp. This was a poisoning operation. Elara pulled a pair of heavy binoculars from her pack. She adjusted the focus, scanning the perimeter of the site. She saw men in heavy tactical gear armed with military-grade rifles patrolling the catwalks. But it was the logo stenciled on the side of the chemical barrels that made her blood run cold. A silver shield with a black wolf's head. She handed the binoculars to Thane. He raised them to his eyes with a trembling hand. When he lowered them, the expression on his face was terrifying. The human weakness was briefly burned away by a cold, absolute fury. "The syndicate," Thane said. His voice was a dead, flat calm. It was the sound of a judge handing down an execution order. "Who is the syndicate?" Elara asked, keeping her voice low. "The Council of Six," Thane replied. His eyes fixed on the black sludge bleeding into his river, the 6 wealthiest regional alphas in the Northwest, led by Lord Alaric. They control the shipping lanes, the major logging contracts, the deep water ports. They have been pressuring me for years to deregulate the protected lands, to open the aquifers for industrial fracking. I refused. I locked them out of the Olympic territory. Thane leaned heavily on his stick, his knuckles white. The puzzle pieces were snapping together with brutal clarity. "This isn't a curse," Thane whispered, the reality of the betrayal sinking into his bones. The silence. "It isn't a magical plague. It's a biological weapon." He pointed a shaking finger at the barrels. Heavy metal toxicity mixed with wolfsbane extract, pumped directly into the underground springs that feed the shifter settlements. They aren't trying to kill the wolves. They are trying to sever the connection. If the border patrols go blind, if my lieutenants are bedridden, I appear weak. If I cannot cure the plague, the people will demand a new king, a king who promises modern solutions. Alaric, Elara concluded. He engineers the crisis, waits for me to fall, and then steps in with a synthetic treatment to save the day, Thane said. And as his reward, the Council of Six takes control of the entire western seaboard. They will strip mine this mountain range until there is nothing left but ash. The sheer scale of the corruption was staggering. The enemy was not a monster in the dark. The enemy was corporate greed. The enemy was a system of men willing to poison their own people, destroy their own land, just to shift the balance of economic power. Thane looked at Elara. The weight of his failure was heavy on his shoulders. My own council, they smiled at my table while they poisoned my water. We have the proof, Elara said, tapping her map. She pulled out a small waterproof camera and snapped a dozen high-resolution photos of the site, making sure to capture the syndicate logos on the barrels and the faces of the armed guards. We document the coordinates. We find the source. We get the cure. And then you take this back to the city and you destroy them. Thane looked at her. Her pragmatism was a physical anchor in a sea of betrayal. She wasn't paralyzed by the politics. She was calculating the counterattack. They know I came into the woods, Thane said, his tactical mind beginning to turn. If Alaric orchestrated this, he knows I am vulnerable here. He would not leave my death to chance. He would send a hunter. The words had barely left his mouth when the forest went completely unnaturally still. Elara felt the shift in the air pressure, the sudden displacement of space behind them. She dropped the camera and spun around her hand, dropping to the heavy hunting knife on her belt. Standing 30 yards away, blocking the only trail back up the ridge, was the scarred guard from the community hall, Captain Briggs. He was not wearing the royal colors. Stripped of his own shifter senses by the crushing weight of the forest, he was forced to rely entirely on human steel. He wore unmarked tactical gear and held a suppressed, high-velocity hunting rifle in his hands. The safety was off. He looked at Thane, then at Elara, and a slow, ugly smile spread across his ruined face. "Nothing personal, my king," Briggs called out, his voice echoing slightly in the damp air. "Lord Alaric just pays a much better dividend, and he prefers a change in management." Thane stepped in front of Elara. He had no weapon, he had no strength, but he was the king. He would die on his feet shielding his people. "You will never make it out of these woods, Briggs," Thane said, his voice carrying the heavy commanding weight of his office, even without the supernatural power behind it. "The Guardian will tear you to pieces." "The Guardian's a myth for old men and children," Briggs sneered, raising the rifle to his shoulder. "I've been tracking you for 2 days. I haven't seen any giant wolves. Just a sick man and a little girl with a map." Elara's mind was moving at 100 miles an hour. She was calculating distance, trajectory, and topography. They were standing on the edge of a steep incline of loose shale. Above Briggs, the ridge line formed a sheer wall of ancient, unstable rock held back only by a tangle of dead roots. She had mapped this exact sector 3 years ago. She knew the structural integrity of that wall was practically non-existent. It was a geological trigger waiting to be pulled. She just needed him to move to his left. Elara grabbed Thane's belt and yanked him hard to the right, diving behind the thick trunk of a fallen cedar, just as Briggs pulled the trigger. The suppressed gunshot sounded like a heavy staple gun. Bark exploded from the wood inches from Thane's head. "Stay down!" Elara hissed, her eyes locking onto the terrain above the assassin. Briggs moved forward, slowly keeping his rifle trained on the fallen tree. "Come on out, Your Majesty. Let's make this clean. I promise I'll make it quick for the girl." Elara reached into her pack. She pulled out a heavy steel grappling hook attached to a coil of climbing rope. She looked at Thane. "When I move, you stay flat against the wood," she whispered. Before Thane could argue, Elara broke cover. She scrambled up the incline to her left, exposing herself completely. Briggs laughed, tracking her easily through his scope. "Stupid girl." He pivoted left, stepping directly into the center of the narrow shale-covered path beneath the unstable rock wall. Elara didn't run away. She threw the heavy steel grappling hook with all her strength. She wasn't aiming at the man. She aimed high toward the tangle of dead roots, holding back 1,000 tons of mountain rock. The heavy steel hook caught the primary anchor root with a solid thud. Briggs fired. The bullet tore through the sleeve of Elara's jacket, grazing her shoulder with a burn like hot iron. She ignored the pain. She wrapped the climbing rope around her forearms, planted her boots deep into the mud, and threw her entire body weight backward. The dead roots snapped with a sound like a cannon shot. Briggs looked up just in time to see the mountain fall on him. The rockslide was instantaneous and deafening. A massive wave of shale boulders and dead timber cascaded down the sheer wall, burying the narrow path under 10 feet of crushing debris. A cloud of thick gray dust bloomed into the air, choking the clearing. Elara dropped the rope, coughing, clutching her bleeding shoulder. She slid back down the incline, landing heavily next to the fallen cedar. Thane was already there. He reached out, grabbing her good arm, pulling her into the shelter of his chest as the last rocks tumbled down the slope. The silence that followed was absolute. The assassin was gone, buried under the mountain. Thane looked at the massive pile of rubble and then down at the young woman in his arms. Her hair was coated in gray dust. Blood was soaking through the sleeve of her denim jacket. She was breathing hard, her green eyes wide with adrenaline, but there was no panic in her face. Only the cold, hard calculation of survival. She had not waited for him to protect her. She had not panicked. She had analyzed the battlefield, weaponized the earth itself, and executed a flawless tactical maneuver. She had saved the Alpha Prime. Again. Thane reached out, his large hand gently gripped her uninjured shoulder. "Let me see the wound," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could barely contain. It was a clean graze, painful but not fatal. They moved a mile away from the rock slide, setting up a cold camp deep in a hollowed-out cavern beneath the root system of a giant redwood. Night 7 descended on the Olympic woods. Elara built a small, smokeless fire deep in the cavern. She cleaned her shoulder with iodine, her face tight with pain, and wrapped a clean bandage around it. Thane sat across the small fire from her. The grueling physical exertion of the day combined with the adrenaline had pushed the toxin deeper into his system, but his mind was sharp. He watched her work. He watched the way she moved, the quiet competence in her hands. He unbuttoned his shirt, shrugging it off to dry near the flames. Elara looked up, her breath catching slightly. The firelight danced across Thane's chest and back. The sheer volume of scar tissue was staggering. There were the expected marks of a warrior, slashes across the ribs, a puncture wound near the collarbone. But across his broad back, there were deeper, older scars. Long, jagged lines of silver tissue that spoke of betrayal, of claws tearing into flesh from behind. Thane saw her looking. He did not turn away. He did not hide the vulnerability of his past. "They were my father's generals," Thane said quietly, his gaze fixed on the fire. "When I took the throne at 22, they decided I was too young to rule. They ambushed me in the high passes of the Cascades. 5 against 1. He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I survived, but I learned a harsh lesson about the nature of power. In my world, an alpha cannot show weakness. You cannot ask for help. You cannot bleed in front of your pack, or they will tear you apart." He gestured toward the scars. "I have spent my entire life standing alone at the top of a mountain, waiting for the knife in the dark, waiting for the system to turn on me." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "For 7 days I have been helpless." Thane continued, his voice dropping to a low, rough rumble. "I have been blind. I have been sick. I have been a burden. And you have not looked at me with pity. You have not looked at me with fear. You just looked at the problem and you fixed it." Elara held his gaze. "You are not a burden. You are a man who was poisoned by cowards." "I see you, Elara," Thane said. The words held a profound tectonic weight. It was not a casual statement. It was a formal acknowledgement. "I see the intellect. I see the courage. The lords in my court, the syndicate, they look at you and see an omega. They see a human. They see nothing, but they are fools." He reached across the small fire. He did not grab her hand. He held his hand open, palm up, offering it, an invitation, not a command. "I am the Alpha Prime," Thane said, the firelight catching the hard, uncompromising lines of his jaw. "But here in the dark, stripped of all my lies and all my power, I am telling you this. You are not beneath me. You are not my subject. You are my equal, in all things." Elara looked at his open hand. She understood the magnitude of what he was offering. He was tearing down the entire social hierarchy of their world. He was offering a partnership built on blood trust and shared survival. She reached out. Her small bandage-wrapped hand clasped his massive, calloused palm. His grip was warm, firm, and incredibly safe. "Partners first," Elara said, her voice steady. "We survive. We get the cure. We bring down the syndicate." "Partners first," Thane agreed. He pulled out her topographic map. He spread it out on the dirt between them. The fire cast long shadows across the paper. "Show me," Thane said, his tactical mind fully engaged. "Show me the terrain. Show me the choke points. When we get back to Seattle, I am going to tear Alaric's empire down to the bedrock. And I want you to help me build the strategy." For the next 2 hours, they did not speak of wolves or magic. They spoke of logistics. They spoke of supply lines, financial ledgers, and legal precedents. Elara's mind was a steel trap for details. She pointed out the geographical vulnerabilities of the syndicate's deepwater ports. She showed him how the illegal drilling site connected to municipal land grants that Alaric had signed off on. They were building a war room in the dirt. They were forging a bond that was stronger than simple attraction. They were building a fortress of mutual respect. On the 9th day, the earth opened up. They had descended deep into a subterranean canyon following a narrow fissure in the rock that Elara had mapped from old geological surveys. The air grew warmer here, heavy with humidity and the smell of ancient, undisturbed soil. They turned a corner in the stone and the darkness was shattered by light. It was a massive underground grotto. A crystal-clear spring bubbled up from the center of the cavern, feeding a shallow, perfectly still pool. Surrounding the edge of the water were clusters of pale, translucent stalks. The leaves were the color of deep ocean water, and the roots were glowing. A soft, pulsing, bioluminescent blue light bathed the cavern walls. The source. They had found it. Elara approached the water's edge with a deep, reverent silence. She did not rush. She knelt on the wet stone. She unrolled a sterile canvas cloth. She reached into the water. She did not rip the plants from the earth. She carefully, meticulously separated a portion of the glowing roots, leaving the main cluster intact so the plant could survive. She placed the glowing roots into a small mortar, added a splash of the pristine spring water, and used a stone pestle to grind it into a thick, glowing paste. She strained the liquid into a small glass vial. She stood up and walked back to Thane. He was leaning against the cavern wall, breathing heavily, the physical toll of the descent showing in the pale gray of his face. She handed him the vial. "Drink it," she said. Thane took the glass. He did not hesitate. He raised it to his lips and swallowed the glowing liquid in a single gulp. The reaction was violent and immediate. Thane dropped the glass. It shattered on the stone floor. He fell to his knees, his hands clutching his chest. He let out a ragged, agonizing shout that echoed off the cavern walls. The heavy metal toxin had embedded itself deep in his cellular structure. The cure was not a gentle healing. It was an eviction. The ancient magic of the root rushed through his veins like liquid fire, seeking out the synthetic poison, binding to it and incinerating it. Thane convulsed his muscles, locking in rigid spasms. Sweat poured from his face. Elara dropped to her knees beside him. She grabbed his shoulders, holding him steady, anchoring him to the physical world just as she had on the third night. "Fight it," she urged. "Push it out." Thane threw his head back, and from deep within his chest a sound emerged. It wasn't a human shout. It was a roar, a deep, earth-shaking, guttural roar of absolute primal power. The silence was broken. The golden light exploded back into Thane's eyes, brighter and more terrifying than before. The sheer force of his alpha presence returned, washing over the cavern like a tidal wave. But it was different now. The crushing, arrogant dominance was gone. It was tempered. It had been filtered through the humbling silence of the forest. It was a power that now understood restraint. Thane stopped shaking. He took a massive, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the damp air of the cavern. He could hear again. He could hear the drip of water hitting stone 100 yards away. He could hear the frantic, rapid flutter of Elara's heartbeat right beside him. He could smell the ozone, the wet earth, the metallic tang of his own sweat. His wolf was back, and it was enraged by the poison it had endured, but fiercely, immediately protective of the woman kneeling beside him. Thane turned his head. He looked at Elara. The moment their eyes met, something snapped into place. It was not a physical sound, but a psychic collision. A tether strong as forged steel slammed into existence between their minds. Thane felt a sudden rushing influx of emotion that did not belong to him. He felt Elara's exhaustion, her fierce intelligence, her overwhelming relief. Elara gasped, falling back a step. She clutched her own chest. She could suddenly feel the heavy thudding rhythm of Thane's heart in her own ribs. She could feel his immense gratitude, his protective fury, and a deep possessive awe that was entirely focused on her. The mate bond, it had not been triggered by a magic spell. It had been forged in the fire of survival. It had been built over 10 days of shared suffering, vulnerability, and mutual respect. The cure had merely removed the final barrier, allowing their souls to recognize what their minds had already decided. They were inexorably, permanently linked. Thane stood up. He moved with a fluid, terrifying grace that had been absent for weeks. He was massive, powerful, restored to his absolute prime. He stepped toward Elara. She did not back away. She stood her ground, looking up at the golden fire in his eyes. "You feel it," Thane said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. "I feel it," Elara confirmed, her voice steady though her heart was racing. "A compass point, a tether." "It is a mate bond," Thane said softly. He stopped a foot away from her. The air between them was crackling with a sudden, overwhelming tension. The physical attraction that they had suppressed beneath the mechanics of survival was suddenly violently present. Thane looked down at her. He saw the dust in her white hair, the bandage on her shoulder, the fierce, uncompromising intelligence in her green eyes. He had never seen anything more beautiful in his entire life. But he remembered his promise. He remembered the firelight on the 7th night. He would not conquer her. He would not command her. Thane reached up to his own neck. He unclasped a heavy chain of dark, oxidized silver. Hanging from the chain was a solid silver medallion stamped with the crest of the Alpha Prime. It was the physical manifestation of his authority, the highest symbol of political power in the Pacific Northwest. He held it out in his massive palm. "I told you that you are my equal," Thane said, his golden eyes locked on hers. "The syndicate will try to destroy you the moment we step out of these woods. They will call you a witch. They will call you an Omega who manipulated a sick king. I will not let them touch you." He stepped closer, invading her personal space but keeping his hands entirely visible. "This is not a collar of submission," Thane said, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent a shiver down Elara's spine. "This is a declaration of war against anyone who dares to question your place at my side. It is a promise of absolute partnership. In politics, in battle, in life." He looked at her lips. The hunger in his eyes was raw and undeniable, but he did not move. "Do you accept the partnership, Elara?" he asked. Elara looked at the heavy silver medallion. She looked at the king who had offered her his power, his trust, and his life. She felt the steady, unbreakable hum of the bond connecting their minds. She stepped forward, closing the final inch between them. "I accept the partnership," she said. Thane lifted the heavy silver chain. He reached around her neck, his large hands surprisingly gentle against her skin, and clasped the metal at the nape of her neck. The prime medallion rested heavy and cold against her collarbone. Thane did not step back. He looked down into her eyes, the golden light in his own swirling with intensity. "May I kiss you?" he asked. The king of the Northwest, the most powerful alpha on the continent, asking permission. Elara reached up. She grabbed the lapels of his open shirt, pulling him down to her level. "Yes," she breathed. When his lips met hers, there was no hesitation. It was not a gentle, tentative exploration. It was the crashing culmination of 3 weeks of fierce survival and profound connection. Thane's arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, lifting her slightly off the stone floor. His kiss was demanding, possessive, fueled by the instinct of the wolf and the desperate gratitude of the man. Elara kissed him back with equal ferocity. She tangled her hands in his dark hair, anchoring herself against the overwhelming physical power of him. She felt the heat of his skin, the frantic unified rhythm of their hearts. The bond flared bright and hot in their minds, a telepathic echo of pure, unadulterated consent and desire. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily. Thane rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his hands gripping her waist as if she were the only solid thing in the universe. "We leave at dawn," Thane rumbled, his voice thick. "We harvest enough root for the town," Elara replied, her voice trembling slightly, her hands still resting flat against his chest. "We cure my father. We cure your guards." Thane opened his eyes. The romance faded, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating intelligence of a king going to war. He looked at the topographic map protruding from her pack. And then, Thane set his jaw, setting into a brutal, unforgiving line, "We go to Seattle. And we drag Lord Alaric and the syndicate out into the light. We are going to put them on trial in front of the entire nation." Elara touched the heavy silver medallion resting against her chest. She felt the cold metal, and beneath it, the steady, indomitable beat of her own heart. She was no longer just an orphaned cartographer. She was the partner of the Alpha Prime. She was the woman who rode the ghost wolf. "They won't know what hit them," Elara said. The forest around them was silent. But it was no longer a suffocating silence. It was the deep, expectant breath before a hurricane. The journey in the dark was over. The battle for the light was about to begin. The rain over Seattle did not fall, it drove. It hammered against the reinforced glass of the Prime Tower, a monolithic spire of steel and black obsidian that stood as the seat of shifter power in the Pacific Northwest. Inside the Grand Hall on the 75th floor, the air was climate-controlled, sterile, and thick with the stench of treason. The room was vast, lined with polished marble and tiered seating designed to accommodate 200 of the highest-ranking pack leaders, corporate liaisons, and regional delegates. Today, every seat was full. They had come to witness a coronation disguised as a memorial. Lord Alaric stood at the center of the dais. He was a man tailored by wealth, wearing a charcoal bespoke suit that hid the predatory bulk of his frame. His silver hair was perfectly swept back. His smile was a calculated fraction of grief. Behind him sat the other 5 members of the syndicate, the Council of 6. They were the architects of the new economy, the barons of shipping, the lords of the timber mills, the men who traded ancient wilderness for offshore bank accounts. "We mourn the Alpha Prime," Alaric's voice echoed through the high-fidelity sound system, dripping with manufactured sorrow. King Thane was a warrior, a traditionalist, but the silence took him just as it has taken so many of our brothers and sisters. He ventured into the Olympic exclusion zone and did not return. The old ways have failed us. The forest did not offer a cure, it offered a grave. A murmur rippled through the assembly. Fear was a highly combustible fuel, and Alaric was expertly managing the fire. "But the Northwest will not fall into chaos," Alaric continued, raising a hand. "The syndicate has authorized the immediate deployment of our private medical divisions. We have synthesized a treatment. Furthermore, to fund this massive undertaking, I am officially enacting emergency protocols. The Olympic protected lands will be open to our industrial partners. We will tame the wild. We will save our people. It was a bloodless coup. It was brilliant. It was entirely built on a lie. The heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the Grand Hall did not creak when they opened. They blew inward with the kinetic force of a detonated vault. The sound of the driving rain roared into the sterile hall, followed immediately by a wave of atmospheric pressure so dense it made the ears of every shifter in the room pop. The murmurs died instantly. The silence that fell over the 200 delegates was absolute. King Thane walked through the doors. He was not wearing a bespoke suit. He wore heavy canvas tactical pants and a dark rain-soaked sweater. His boots were caked in the ancient dark mud of the Olympic timber, but it was not his clothes that paralyzed the room. It was the sheer, unadulterated magnitude of his presence. The sickness was gone. The human frailty had been burned away. The golden light in his eyes was blinding, projecting an aura of alpha dominance so pure, so untainted by politics, that 3 delegates in the back row instinctively dropped to their knees, their heads bowed in involuntary submission. But Thane did not walk alone. His right hand was firmly, unapologetically gripping the hand of a woman. Elara walked beside the king. She wore her dirt-stained denim jacket, the shoulder heavily bandaged where the assassin's bullet had grazed her. Her white hair was damp plastered against her neck. Against the polished marble and the tailored suits, she looked like a wild thing dragged into a museum. But her chin was up. Her green eyes swept the room with the cold, assessing gaze of a cartographer reading a hostile landscape. Resting heavy and undeniable against her collarbone was the oxidized silver medallion of the Alpha Prime. Alaric's polished smile vanished. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped, revealing the terrified, calculating coward beneath the expensive wool. Lord Alaric, Thane's voice boomed. He did not use a microphone. He didn't need one. The resonance of his chest carried the words into the marrow of every person present. You are holding a funeral for a man who is not dead, and you are selling land that you do not own. Thane and Elara walked down the center aisle. The crowd parted for them like water retreating from a fault line. No one dared to breathe. No one dared to cross the invisible crackling perimeter of the king's fury. Guards, Alaric shouted, his voice cracking the polished veneer, shattering completely. The king is compromised. The silence broke his mind. That woman, that human, is a witch of the woods. She has bound him with dark magic. Restrain them. A dozen heavily armed private security contractors, men loyal to the syndicate's payroll, not the crown, stepped out from the alcoves, raising their weapons. Thane did not flinch. He did not shift into his wolf. He did not roar. He simply stopped walking. I invoke the law of truth, Thane stated. The words were quiet, but they struck the room like the tolling of an iron bell. The law of truth was a legal mechanism older than the Prime Tower, older than the state of Washington. It was the fundamental bedrock of their society, designed to prevent civil war. When invoked by a sitting Alpha Prime in the presence of the full assembly, all violence was strictly forbidden. It demanded an immediate public tribunal based entirely on physical evidence. To fire a weapon during the invocation was an act of absolute treason, punishable by immediate execution by the pack. The security contractors hesitated. They looked at Alaric. Then they looked at the 200 delegates who were suddenly staring at the mercenaries with hostility. The pack would not tolerate the murder of their king during a sacred rite. The contractors slowly lowered their rifles. Thane turned to the assembly. He released Elara's hand, stepping back a half-pace, yielding the floor to her. It was a gesture of profound, undeniable respect that sent a shockwave through the old guard politicians. He was not shielding her. He was presenting her as his equal. My brothers and sisters, Thane addressed the room, I was poisoned, not by a curse, not by the forest, but by the men sitting on that dais. They manufactured the silence. They poisoned the aquifers to cripple this nation, to force a regime change, and to steal the Olympic timber. I stand before you cured thanks to the guardian of the woods, and thanks to the woman who holds the evidence of their treason. He looked at Elara. The floor is yours, partner. Elara stepped up to the massive digital presentation table in the center of the hall. She unslung her heavy canvas pack. It hit the polished glass surface with a dull, heavy thud. She did not look at Alaric. She did not engage with his screaming accusations. She was a professional. She operated on data. Elara unzipped the pack. She pulled out a massive hand-drawn topographic map on heavy vellum paper and unrolled it across the digital scanner. Instantly, the high-definition screen suspended above the dais flared to life, projecting her intricate cartography to the entire room. "I am Elara," she spoke into the podium microphone. Her voice was steady, rhythmic, lacking the theatricality of a politician. "I have mapped the Olympic region for 7 years. What you are looking at on the screen is the primary subterranean aquifer that feeds 60% of the shifter settlements in the lower valleys." She tapped a command on the console. A secondary overlay appeared on the screens in bright red. "10 days ago, King Thane and I discovered an illegal heavy industrial drilling site hidden deep within the exclusion zone," Elara continued. She pulled out the waterproof camera and plugged it into the terminal. Photographs flashed onto the massive screens, high-resolution images of the rusted barrels, the black sludge bleeding into the pristine water, the armed guards patrolling the catwalks, and most damning of all, zoomed-in crystal-clear shots of the silver shield and black wolf logo stenciled on the chemical drums. The Grand Hall erupted into a low, dangerous rumble. The evidence was irrefutable. It wasn't hearsay. It was photographic documentation of an environmental atrocity. "The toxin is a synthetic compound of heavy metals and wolfsbane extract," Elara explained, her green eyes scanning the crowd, holding their attention through sheer, unwavering competence. "It does not kill the body immediately. It severs the neurological connection to your shifter instincts. It creates the silence. It was deployed upstream from your homes, targeting your children, your elders, your border patrols." "Forgery!" Alaric screamed, gripping the edge of his podium, his knuckles white. "She doctored those photos. She drew that map in a cabin. Where is the proof of ownership? Where is the connection to the syndicate? You have nothing but pictures of barrels in the mud." Alaric was desperate, but he was right about the burden of proof. The law of truth required a definitive paper trail to execute a sitting lord. A logo on a barrel could be written off as a setup, a frame job by an unknown third party. Elara looked at Alaric. She did not raise her voice. She simply waited for him to finish yelling. "You are correct, Lord Alaric," Elara said calmly. "A logo is not a conviction, which is why I am not the final witness." She looked toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the hall. The doors opened again, this time quietly. A woman stepped into the grand hall. She was in her late 20s, wearing a sharp-tailored business suit. Her hands were trembling, slightly clutching a heavy encrypted solid-state drive against her chest. She looked terrified, but she kept walking forward, her heels clicking a steady rhythm on the marble floor. Elara felt a sudden sharp ache in her chest. It was Sarah, her older sister. They had not spoken in 4 years. When Gareth had taken Elara in, Sarah had already been leaving for the city. Sarah had wanted wealth. She had wanted to escape the dirt and the poverty of the logging towns. She had climbed the corporate ladder with ruthless efficiency, eventually securing a position as the chief financial archivist for Alaric's primary holding company. She had looked down on Elara's life in the mud. But blood, when tested, holds a weight that money cannot buy. When Elara had used a satellite phone from a logging outpost just moments after emerging from the tree line 2 days ago, calling to tell her about the poisoned water and Gareth's collapse, the corporate armor had finally cracked. Sarah walked down the aisle. She did not look at the angry delegates. She did not look at the furious, panicked faces of the syndicate. She looked only at Elara. She reached the center table. She placed the encrypted drive onto the glass. "My name is Sarah." She spoke into the microphone, her voice shaking before she forced it steady. "I am the senior financial comptroller for Vanguard Holdings, the shell corporation managed by Lord Alaric and the Council of Six." Alaric lunged forward over the dais. "You ungrateful bitch, I will ruin you. Guards, arrest her for corporate espionage." "Stand down!" Thane roared, the sound hitting the room like a physical shockwave. The guards froze physically, unable to overcome the Prime's direct command. Thane pointed a massive finger at Alaric. "Let the witness speak." Sarah swallowed hard. She plugged the drive into the terminal. She typed in a rapid sequence of decryption codes. The massive screens above the dais shifted. The photos of the barrels were replaced by endless columns of financial ledgers, banking transfer receipts, and digital signatures. "This drive contains the internal black book ledgers for the past 3 years," Sarah said, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the hall. She was committing professional suicide. She was risking her life, but she was saving her soul. "It details the illegal purchase of the drilling equipment. It traces the offshore payments to the chemical manufacturers. It contains the exact GPS coordinates of the drop sites, which perfectly match my sister's topographic map." Sarah tapped the screen one final time. A single undeniable document appeared on the main screen. "And this," Sarah said, stepping back from the podium, is the executive order authorizing the deployment of the toxin into the Olympic aquifer. It is signed by all 6 members of the syndicate. The metadata is time-stamped, encrypted, and irrefutable. The silence in the room fractured. It broke into 1,000 pieces of pure violent outrage. The 200 delegates, men and women, who had watched their pack members suffer and die over the last 2 weeks, turned their eyes toward the dais. The anger was a physical, suffocating heat in the room. The system had not just failed them. The system had actively slaughtered them for profit. Alaric realized in a single terrifying second that the political game was over. He could not buy his way out of a signed confession. He could not spin a narrative against hard data. The law had cornered him. If he could not win by the law, he would break the board. "Kill them!" Alaric screamed, his voice a feral shriek. He abandoned his human form, his bones cracking, his suit tearing, as he forced a rapid, monstrous shift into a massive gray wolf. The other 5 lords of the syndicate followed suit, their bodies distorting into beasts of desperate violence. "Kill the king. Kill the witnesses. Open fire." The corrupt security contractors, realizing their own complicity was documented on the drive, raised their automatic rifles. They didn't care about the law of truth anymore. They cared about survival. Thane stepped in front of Elara and Sarah, his chest broad, ready to take the hail of bullets. But the bullets never fired, because the storm outside the Prime Tower suddenly stopped. The driving rain suspended in midair. The wind died completely. The atmospheric pressure inside the Grand Hall spiked so violently that the reinforced glass windows lining the eastern wall began to emit a high-pitched, agonizing whine. Every head in the room turned toward the glass. Standing on the narrow exterior balcony, 75 stories above the streets of Seattle, was the ghost wolf. It defied physics. It defied logic. A beast the size of a draft horse standing on a steel precipice in the sky. Its pristine white fur glowed with a pale ethereal luminescence against the dark storm clouds. Its ancient, fathomless silver eyes stared directly through the glass, locking onto the 6 corrupt wolves on the dais. The ghost wolf did not growl. It opened its massive jaws and let out a soundless roar. The reinforced glass of the eastern wall detonated. It didn't just shatter, it vaporized into a million harmless, glittering diamonds that rained down over the assembly. The cold wind of the Pacific howled into the room. The psychic weight of the Guardian's presence slammed into the Grand Hall. It was the same crushing pressure Thane had felt in the woods, but magnified 100-fold. Every shifter in the room, including the 200 delegates, the security guards, and the corrupt lords, was instantly driven to their knees. The rifles clattered uselessly to the marble floor from hands that could no longer grip them. The 6 wolves of the syndicate were plastered against the marble floor of the dais, whining in absolute primal terror, unable to lift their heads against the sheer crushing authority of the earth itself. Only 3 people remained standing. King Thane, whose wolf had already been humbled and accepted by the Guardian, Sarah, who possessed no wolf to suppress, and Elara. Elara walked through the kneeling crowd. She ignored the glittering shards of glass crunching beneath her boots. She walked straight to the shattered threshold of the eastern wall. She stood before the ghost wolf. The cold wind whipped her white hair around her face. She reached out, placing her bare-scarred hand gently against the beast's massive snout. The ghost wolf closed its silver eyes, leaning into her touch, acknowledging its chosen rider. The statement was absolute. The power in the room did not belong to the men in suits. It did not belong to the guns. It belonged to the woman who spoke for the earth. For the awe in the room could fully settle, a new sound cut through the howling wind. It was a heavy, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack. 3 massive military-grade transport helicopters descended through the storm clouds, their searchlights cutting through the gloom, illuminating the shattered side of the Prime Tower. They bore no corporate logos. They bore the ancient, intricate crest of the North American Alliance, the Alliance of Elders, the Supreme Court of the Shifter World, a body of ancient, impossibly powerful men and women who rarely intervened in regional politics, existing only to ensure the survival of the species. The helicopters hovered just beyond the balcony. Heavy steel cables dropped down and a dozen figures rappelled onto the marble floor. They wore simple, functional gray coats. They were old. Their faces were weathered like mountain stone. But their eyes held the cold, objective judgment of centuries. The lead elder, a man with a face like a hatchet and hair the color of iron, stepped into the Grand Hall. The ghost wolf looked at him, gave a single slow blink of acknowledgement, and then without a sound stepped off the edge of the balcony, vanishing into the driving rain. The crushing pressure lifted from the room. The delegates gasped for air, pulling themselves up from the floor. The security guards shrank back against the walls, terrified. The iron-haired elder walked straight to the digital presentation table. He did not look at Alaric, who had shifted back into his human form and was cowering naked and shivering on the dais. The elder looked at the financial ledgers. He looked at the topographic map. He looked at the executive order bearing the signatures of the syndicate. He turned to Elara. "You compiled this data. I mapped the terrain," Elara said, her voice unwavering. "My sister compiled the financials. The king secured the physical evidence." The elder looked at Sarah, then at Thane. He offered a slow, deeply respectful nod. It was the ultimate validation. "The evidence is pristine," the elder declared, his voice carrying the finality of a falling guillotine. He turned his cold gaze to the dais, Lord Alaric and the Council of Six. "You have violated the deepest covenants of our kind. You have poisoned the earth. You have attacked your own people for profit. You have attempted the murder of a sitting prime." Alaric tried to speak, tried to beg, but his throat was frozen with terror. "There will be no prison," the elder stated, the absolute authority of the Alliance echoing in the ruined hall. "There will be no corporate buyout. By the mandate of the Alliance, you are stripped of all titles. Your assets are seized and will be redirected to the medical rehabilitation of the lower valleys. Your bloodlines are struck from the registry." The elder signaled to his enforcers. "You are sentenced to permanent, irrevocable exile," the elder finished. "You will be taken to the high tundra of the Alaskan interior. You will be stripped of your wealth, your clothes, and your human comforts. You will live as beasts in the ice until the cold takes you. Take them." The Alliance enforcers moved with brutal efficiency. They dragged the screaming, sobbing lords of the syndicate from the dais. There was no dignity in their exit. They were broken men being dragged away to disappear into the frozen dark. The security contractors were disarmed and marched out in zip ties destined for federal shifter lockup. The grand hall slowly quieted, the only sound the wind howling through the shattered glass. The corruption had been excised. The cancer had been cut out with a scalpel of pure, unadulterated truth. Thane walked over to Elara. He looked at her sister Sarah, who was wiping a tear from her cheek, the adrenaline finally crashing. "Your sister is a hero of the Northwest," Thane said to Elara, making sure his voice carried to the remaining delegates. "She will have a place on my new council, if she wants it." Sarah looked at the king, then at Elara. The years of estrangement could not be erased in a day, but the bridge had been rebuilt. She nodded, a genuine fragile smile touching her lips. "I would be honored, my king." Thane turned his attention entirely to Elara. The political theater was over. The room was full of people, but as far as the Alpha Prime was concerned, they were the only two living souls on the continent. He reached out his hand, gently touching the bandaged wound on her shoulder. His golden eyes were soft, filled with an emotion that was far deeper than gratitude. It was absolute, unconditional reverence. "You saved my life in the mud," Thane said quietly, the mate bond humming brightly between them. "You saved my kingdom in the light. I am a king only because you allowed me to be." Elara looked up at him. She reached up her hand, resting against his jaw. "We are partners," she reminded him, her green eyes shining with quiet strength. "That was the deal." "That is the deal," Thane agreed. He leaned down, and right there in front of the 200 delegates, the Alliance elders, and the shattered glass of the old world, he kissed her. It was a seal on a new era, an era where strength was not defined by the volume of a roar, but by the courage to stand in the light. 6 months later, the air in the high Cascades was crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of melting snow and blooming alpine phlox. The deep winter had finally broken, surrendering to the vibrant, aggressive life of a mountain spring. Elara stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed Federal Environmental Monitoring Station, overlooking the vast emerald expanse of the Olympic timber. She was not wearing denim today. She wore high-end, lightweight tactical gear, an encrypted tablet strapped to her forearm, and the silver prime medallion resting proudly over her heart. She tapped the screen on her tablet. A real-time holographic map of the region flickered to life. The red markers that once denoted the illegal drilling sites were gone. In their place were green zones, heavily protected sectors, monitored by a newly established coalition of human and shifter ecologists. The Black Book funds seized from the syndicate had been repurposed entirely. Down in the valley, the community hall had been rebuilt into a state-of-the-art medical and educational facility. Gareth was down there, his amber eyes bright and focused, teaching a class of young pups how to track without relying solely on their noses. The silence was a dark memory. The water was clean. More importantly, the laws had changed. The massive topographic maps Elara had drawn by hand were now the official, legally binding geographical documents of the Northwest Territory. And drafted beside them, signed into law by the Alpha Prime, was the Omega Protections Act, a sweeping set of legislations that dismantled the old pack hierarchies, guaranteeing equal representation, property rights, and legal protection for every shifter and human, regardless of their birth status or physical strength. Footsteps sounded on the wooden planks of the deck, heavy, familiar, and steady. Elara didn't need to turn around. The tether in her mind flared with a warm, comforting golden light. She could feel his quiet contentment, his pride, and his enduring foundational love. Thane stepped up behind her. He wore a simple flannel shirt and hiking boots, looking less like a king and more like the man he was always meant to be. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, pulling her back against his solid chest. He rested his chin on the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. Dr. Aldous just sent the final water purity reports. Thane murmured, his deep voice vibrating against her back. The aquifers are 100% clean. The heavy metals are completely flushed. The forest heals itself, Elara said, leaning her weight into him, her hands resting over his massive forearms. It just needed us to stop hurting it. Thane looked out over the vast, endless sea of green pines. He looked at the jagged, snow-capped peaks in the distance. He remembered the blinding arrogance he had carried into those woods 6 months ago. He remembered the crushing, humbling silence. The old lords used to say that America was built by the Alphas, Thane said quietly, his gaze sweeping the horizon. They said it was built by the men with the loudest roars and the sharpest teeth. They thought power was a weapon you used to beat the world into submission. He turned to Elara in his arms. He looked down into her green eyes, the eyes of the cartographer, the healer, the woman who had walked into the dark and brought him back into the light. They were wrong, Thane said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached up his thumb, gently tracing the line of her cheekbone. True strength isn't the ability to dominate. True strength is the courage to map the hard path. The courage to stand in front of a monster and ask for peace. The courage to drag the truth into the light, no matter what it costs. Elara smiled. It was a small, private smile reserved only for the man who shared her soul. You're getting philosophical in your old age prime, she teased softly. Thane chuckled, a deep, rich sound that echoed over the mountain air. He pulled her close, kissing her forehead. Just observant partner, he replied. They stood together on the edge of the world, watching the sun break through the clouds, casting long golden rays over the healed earth.